that?
Yeah, so I think for me, it was 2018, right? Because ultimately I was a marketer, but I was more on the technical end of things. So I was dealing with the tracking, the implementation of codes, and analysis of data. And when GDPR came into play, a lot of my clients freaked out and they went to the person that was dealing with the data to find out if everything was good. And that just got me really curious. And I started going down that rabbit hole, which led me to here because I just started realizing, I mean, I've always been quite into the ethics of how to use data already before, but this got me a lot more into this trajectory of, okay, data protection and how that can aid in terms of the ethics and the respect to our customers. And that was the initial pivot. I obviously stayed in data quite a bit. I just combined the two, and now I've completely pivoted over.
I'm just curious, was there something in your marketing world that you're like, whoa, like we're thinking about this backwards? And like I know you like data lifecycle is like a big, point of what you do. So I'd just kind of like to know your perspective there and like how companies can rethink their data collection, how they're using data, and retention strategies, particularly for marketing teams.
Yeah, I think, what I used to say is that back when I was working with data, we had this playground of data. We just got to do everything with everything, right? And it was amazing. Don't get me wrong. It was amazing because it was a chance for us to explore what we could even figure out, how to profile users if we wanted to. What could we do with that data? So this is sort of when I was working with data. And it was really exciting, but at the same time, something felt really wrong. And now with all the regulation around everything, it's ultimately saying we're taking that playground away from you, but you still need to figure out how to market. And I think that's a good thing, don't get me wrong, but for a lot of us it did feel like you were taking away what we really enjoyed. um so but I think that ultimately all that data collection is wrong because it was data collection not for a purpose. It was just, let's collect everything and see what we might do, or what some people like to call just in case data. Whereas now we really have to think about it a little bit more. So the way I like to think about it is like, what actions are you going to take on the knowledge that the data is going to give you? If you don't know that, then there a reason for you to collect it? Now, there are other reasons to collect data occasionally, but in marketing generally, we want everything just in case we might be able to use it. And the shift needs to happen where you have to start backwards. You essentially have to say, you have to forecast what you will do with the information you will receive, and then decide what data you need to get that information. So you need to be a lot more of a big picture thinker. You need to be a lot more strategic, and you need to think ahead. And that's not necessarily as easy when you're in a field that needs to be also reactive. But it works. I mean, if you do it well and you do it right, you can really think about what you need and how you can get that respectfully and, with consent or in a way that you're allowed to, and then make that work for you. It's a big shift when you've had everything and now you have to be a lot more strategic about what you do with your data.
I like your concept of just in case data. That's a great way to put it. And I also I'm seeing it from a marketer's perspective based on what you said about taking away. That's what it has felt like, I feel, for a number of marketers that, these privacy laws are taking something from me, but really we're trying to flip that script and say, hey, what are you using this data for? Let's get the max value out of it instead of just collecting for, whatever reason and then not having a strategic plan. I'm curious, Siobhan, where have you seen marketers go wrong? Like maybe it's this just in case data, like an example of what like common problems you see from client to client to client.
I think what I see most commonly is that there's a lack of awareness of what you're actually doing. So most of the time, regardless of what aspect of marketing is pulling me in, they're not actually aware of what data they're collecting, why they're collecting it, how long they're retaining it for, if it's ever being deleted. So for them, it's just, what can we do with what we need, right? So if you're an email marketer, I have an email list, I can just send it. But there needs to be an understanding, and this is why we do a lot of data mapping, right, of the data flows, because there needs to be an understanding how that data has come in, under what conditions that data has come into the system, and then what the purpose for that data was. Because it is very easy when you suddenly have all that data to say, oh, okay, I'll use it for this and I'll use it for this, and you really can't. So this is really the biggest problem. Now, there are obviously tools that you can set up to make sure that this doesn't happen, but even those tools, you need to label the data correctly and when it comes in to make sure that that works. And this is the struggle that most have. The struggle most have is that they lack complete awareness of what's going on and how the data came in. And then the next kind of step is, how do we delete that data and get rid of that data? And then if we only have this data, how do we maximize our marketing off of it? And that's obviously a marketing struggle that they're going to have to deal with, and they're going to have to figure out how they can take the data and utilize it to the best of their ability within the regulations or within the rules that have now been set to that data. But that's the main struggle I'm seeing.
Interesting. I'm curious, when you did write about I know you can't really talk about case studies because a lot of your clients come to you with problems and they don't necessarily want to air those problems to the whole world. So I know you can't share like specific case studies, but you did mention back in November there was a team that turned their entire marketing department around by focusing on privacy. So I'm kind of curious if you could share a little bit of like what a win story is like. So like not like, okay, here's all the bad things you're doing, but like how you turn it around and like what that means for the business.
Yeah, I mean, I can say some of the bad things because this was a classic case. So it pretty much sums up a lot of marketing departments, but this was a quite a large e-commerce business in Europe, and they realized. The really interesting thing about them is that they had a push from the top to change the culture around everything regarding data protection, which was a really pleasant situation to be in because there was a motivation to try and change. And the marketing team needed to figure out how to still, make money and grow in a way that they didn't think was possible. It took a lot of time, but we essentially got to take a look at everything that was happening and then really needed to build a strategy that said, okay, what's actually working? Because I think what happens, especially in larger teams sometimes, is that you spend a lot of money, let's say, on ads or, on campaigns that might not have an actual ROI, or they do have an ROI that you can't really measure, or it's really long tail. So you really need to understand that data and understand what's happening. And what we realized looking at everything is that we were, number one, collecting way too much that we didn't need. And secondly, that there was a lot of money being spent, in this case in Facebook specifically, that didn't actually have a return. So the way we managed to not just shift the way we thought about data, we got really lucky in the sense that we unearthed something that had been done for so long, so it was a standard that we didn't have to do that anymore, and that ended up making the ultimate ROI of the marketing department ended up going up because we got to reduce all this spend. And then the data that they did get was so valuable, and the campaigns that did do on the data they had with consent and with people expecting to be marketed to ended up converting a lot higher. Because the user, right, the customer, the person at the other end expected that because they gave consent for it. And that allowed for the data that they end up collecting, which was a lot less, made the data systems a lot easier and simpler and cleaner, more accurate data. They ended up using all of that, marketed better to less people, got more out of it, and ended up reducing their spend. So therefore, ultimately, they end up having a really good win. But this doesn't happen all the time. Right. So I'm just going to say that. But that was a really nice scenario. And there was a lot of factors that came in to make that a really good situation.
Wow. I'm happy to hear that there was actually like a positive ROI. So it sounds like just truly more fundamentally understanding your data, whether it's for a privacy use case or any other use case. Like if a company hasn't done that, there is like meat on the bone that they can go pick off of and potentially even pay for this privacy project. I have no idea how much all of this saved them, but that's a really cool story, Siobhan. Thank you so much for sharing that. I just have one question regarding that. You said there was executive buy-in. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because that's something we sometimes don't always see either. So I just wanted like a 30-second take on what that was like.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, one of the founders, who had been following me for a while and has had some conversations with me, has decided that this is something he truly wanted to try and instill in the company because these were values he aligned with. So when it comes from such a kind of important figure, then everyone else kind of needs to align. And in his mind, strategically, it made sense. He decided that if this whole company decides to switch over, it's just like a lot of people go down the sustainability route. He aligned it with that. He goes, our customers, the people who are interested in us, want this ultimately in the long term. They're going to want this. This is what's going to make a decision. And therefore, I'm going to do this now so that we're ahead of the game. So it was a really unique situation. I don't see this very often. A lot of times it takes quite a bit of convincing.
Yeah, so it's cool that you have such an amazing win story.